The game is called the Elden Ring, and it's a sequel to a video game that came out a few years ago called Dark Souls, and it came out.
There's been a lot of discourse recently about the canonicity of Nightreign and how it relates to the games it draws from, especially the Dark Souls trilogy. There's a significant segment of the Dark Souls fandom that seems concerned that Nightreign may have canonically named the Nameless King. Several people have pointed out that there's nothing in Nightreign that explicitly connects the name Grin to the Nameless King. In fact, I'd argue that the natural conclusion, without any more context, would be that Grin is a god of war from the Elden Ring universe, considering the fact that the NPC who talks to you about Grin is an Elden Ring character, not a Dark Souls one. But this minor controversy did bring the question of Nightreign's canonicity to the forefront. Some people have argued that Nightreign isn't canon, others say it's a parallel universe, and some fail to grasp the distinction. Personally, without having seen any of the discourse, I wouldn't have ever been inclined to view Nightreign as canon to the other games at all. I would think of it more along the lines of how Zelda fans view Hyrule Warriors, where it's just a way to have fun with these characters and combat mechanics, but it's not meant to be taken seriously at all. But that's really just going on vibes more than anything else. It just doesn't feel like something that we're meant to glean canon from. I mean, there's not even item descriptions in the game. And why would there be? There's not even time to read them. But it's never been stated by anyone at FromSoft not to be canon. Then again, going back to the Zelda metaphor, as far as I'm aware, Ripened Tinkle's Balloon Trip of Love has never been explicitly said to be non-canon, but I don't see anyone trying to fit it into some silly Zelda timeline. But that's my own personal expectation going off of vibes and what I've seen other games do. I tend to expect spin-off games to be non-canon unless otherwise stated. So why is the default assumption that this game is canon unless we have official confirmation that it's not? Hey, let's talk about fighting games real quick, because this is fucking insane, right? I mean, like, if we tried to extrapolate canon from this, like, the official lore of Soul Calibur 6 tells us that portals opened connecting different worlds, and that's how Geralt met and fell madly in love with Voldo, prompting Cervantes to fly into a jealous rage, which is obviously how the Witcher ended up fighting in that tournament. Probably. I don't know, I haven't played that game, but I mean, come on, this story writes itself. Point is, do you think Soul Calibur 6 is canon to the Witcher lore? Or for an even better example, Arya Stark in Multiverses. Is this where she went sailing off to after the end of Game of Thrones? She's been hanging out with Shaggy in Steven Universe? Nightreign was obviously inspired by Fortnite. Maybe we should talk about the canonicity of that game. I don't even know where to start with that one. Normally, we, as in society in general, we have enough media literacy to interpret for ourselves whether something is meant to be canon. So why do we need it to be explicitly said one way or the other this time? Yeah, no, I heard it when I said it. I am going to walk that statement back a bit. I don't want to be caught accusing society of having a decent level of media literacy. Remember when Squirrel Girl defeated Thanos? No, of course you don't, because that never happened. At least, canonically, it didn't happen. There is a comic with that story, but that issue is a holiday special, and it's just filled with jokes and silly one-shot stories that you're not meant to take seriously. But, of course, comic fans freaked out about it, got stupid, and started making arguments about how Thanos is a joke because he got beat up by someone as weak as Doreen. So, yeah, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that there's a debate over whether Nightreign is canon. FYI, this is the third time I've recorded this video. The second version was fine, I liked it, but then I broke my phone and had to start over again. We don't need to talk about that. But originally, in the first version of this video, I went off on too many tangents, talking about how the idea of canon has been warped and stretched and sometimes just ignored by all sorts of media companies, and I got off track. Apparently I have a lot to say about the way corporations, and sometimes writers, tend to disregard canon, except for the purpose of making sales, and even writers who do care about the lore they're setting up often end up changing their minds later on about the canonicity of things they've written, and the histories and mythologies of fictional properties constantly gets reshaped and deformed, and I kind of wanted to rant about that a bit. And I still do, so I decided to take that stuff and rework it into a separate video to follow this one. And with all of that in mind, the companies that couldn't care less about canon just wanting to pump out products, and the franchises with canon that's constantly in flux, how do we differentiate between things that are not meant to be taken seriously, they're just for fun, and things that are meant to establish real, hard canon? Maybe the reason people are willing to attribute more canonicity to Nightreign than something like Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl is that FromSoft consistently treats their canon with more respect than other companies do. Well, I would have thought that before Elden Ring got a manga and a spin-off game and an upcoming movie adaptation, not to mention the fact that From's next game is a multiplayer Switch 2 title. I mean, don't get me wrong, I hope the Elden Ring movie will be good and won't take too many creative liberties, and I enjoy the manga for what it is, but it certainly isn't taking the lore seriously. And even the DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, did some things that made me question how much they really care about the canon. Minor things here and there. I love that DLC, and I don't want to use this video to nitpick it, but the lore of Elden Ring is certainly not some sort of sacred scripture that From Software would never dare to besmirch for the sake of making a few bucks. So, is Nightreign canon? Is the manga canon? Will the movie be canon? Is Elden Ring itself canon? If you're going to rely only on official statements from the company that owns the IP for what you consider canon, then the only official statement we have to go on is that Nightreign is set in another universe. Obviously, I have issues with that method of determining canon, and personally, I think of all of it as adaptations with varying degrees of separation from the true Elden Ring canon, which is whatever George R.R. Martin wrote for FromSoft originally. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that, and most likely none of us will ever know exactly what Martin wrote. But it's obvious that the sensible way to interpret even Elden Ring itself is as an adaptation. Or do you actually think the entirety of the Lands Between is about 80 square kilometers, or a bit smaller than Manhattan? That would be an incredibly tiny world. I would argue that the original concept art is more canonical than what we see in-game because that's the true vision of the people who designed the world before it gets filtered through the lens of a video game. Ideas always have to be compromised when being represented in a game, whether it's the power level of a boss, or the size of the map, or whatever. Game developers' first priority is making games fun to play. Lore comes second. So, unfortunately, the only thing that I would really consider true Elden Ring canon is something that none of us will ever get to read. We can only take guesses at the original, uncompromised lore based on what the game tells us. We do know that Martin's contributions are a lot more substantial than many FromSoft fans would have you believe, due to interviews with Miyazaki that reveal that it was Martin who wrote about the Shattering and the demigods and developed the map before it was translated into something that could be represented by a video game. So I would consider Nightreign to be canon if it fits with and naturally follows from what Martin wrote, which, again, I haven't read. But Nightreign definitely does not fit with the previously established lore of the Souls games. First of all, we have the distinct, unrelated cosmogonies of Dark Souls and Elden Ring. In Dark Souls, there was an unformed, amorphous world devoid of life and death, where nothing ever happened until, for some unexplained reason, the world caught fire, and the first flame brought disparity, heat and cold, life and death. You know how it goes. In Elden Ring, it seems that life was created by the Greater Will splitting the One Great into distinct parts that became all of the individual life forms in the universe. These are totally different creation myths, entirely separate from and unrelated to one another. And crucially, those creation myths are reflected in the core mechanics of the games. In Dark Souls, we collect souls and rest at bonfires, reminiscent of the original capital T, they, thems, finding the souls of the lords in the flames. And in Elden Ring, we're given life by the grace of the Erdtree and we rest at sites of grace. The source of the Erdtree is of course the Elden Ring, and the Elden Ring itself was sent by the Greater Will. Each of these universes has their own pantheons and creation myths and laws for how reality works. Mashing them together in a shared multiverse just doesn't make sense. Usually a fictional multiverse, like Marvel's or DC's, will come about because of something akin to the real-life many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, where each universe has many different futures, each existing in their own universe, Because universes are constantly splitting in two, creating more and more parallel universes, and each universe progresses in sometimes drastically different ways due to the butterfly effect. But these universes all share one origin, even if DC can't decide what their origin is. I mean, it isn't necessarily logically inconsistent to have a multiverse that's just a collection of different universes that aren't related to one another, but it's also not particularly compelling. It's just kind of lazy, bad writing to take completely different universes that work in different ways and have their own cosmogonies and say, yeah, these are all part of a multiverse with a shared canon. That sucks. And side note, can everyone please stop calling the alternate realities in Peacemaker dimensions? I know that's the word Chris uses in the show.
Best dimension ever.
But he's wrong. It's a universe, not a dimension. The constant misuse of the word dimension in all fiction is like my biggest pet peeve. It just drives me crazy. Anyway, other than the cosmogonies, the other thing that really just doesn't make sense if we take Nightreign as canon is the motivations of the characters. Why the hell is Morgott hunting down the Nightfarers? In Elden Ring, the motivation is obvious. Morgott has taken the role of protector of the Erd Tree and defender of the Golden Order, and without knowing what the player would do if they got their hands on the Elden Ring, of course a staunch defender of the established order would try to prevent us from reaching the Erd Tree. That just makes sense. In Nightreign, Morgott's just being a hater. And we could say similar things about the Nameless King too. You have to go out of your way in Dark Souls 3 to pick that fight, ignoring clear warnings not to ring the bell. In Nightreign though, who knows? And probably the biggest lore implication in a canonized Nightreign would be the addition of Zelda-style bird people into the Elden Ring multiverse. This might be the biggest sin of all in terms of how it disrespects the original Elden Ring lore. We already had bird people, multiple kinds, from the Misbegotten to the Crucible Knights and the Divine Bird Warriors, all of which link to the Crucible. And it's important to the lore that all of these different bird people are despised and persecuted by the Golden Order. And maybe I'm just being exactly what the game is criticizing when I say this, but I think it should be understandable why people are disturbed by them when you look at them. The Pinion folk just look too sleek and cool and, I called them Zelda bird people for a reason. They look like something out of a Nintendo game, not out of a FromSoft game. One of the great things about Elden Ring lore that elevates it above the mythos of games like Dungeons & Dragons, Zelda, The Elder Scrolls, and most fantasy stories is that the lore of the fantasy races and species is a direct extension of the overarching lore. So, analyzing inhabitants of this world teaches you about the world itself, and vice versa. Whether we're talking about the anatomy of the trolls and the implications regarding the fire giants and fell god, or what the existence of the Draconians implies about the ancient dragons and their cult, the lore of the species and races can't be separated from the lore of the world in general. And the Misbegotten are the prime example of that. You can't learn about them without learning about the Crucible. But with the Pinion folk, that approach to lore is thrown out in favor of a cool bird guy. I would have loved to play as a Misbegotten, but no, we get a Rito, who means nothing to the overall lore. Obviously, I think canonizing Nightreign creates bigger problems than possibly giving a name to the Nameless King, which I agree would suck. But not liking something the game does doesn't make it non-canon. Luckily, we also have this quote from the director, which many people have taken as confirmation of Nightrein's canonicity, but honestly, it really works much better in the exact opposite way. See, while most people were focused on the split timeline aspect of the quote, they overlooked this bit right here. This is an acquiescence to fans who need everything to be connected and canonical. It's not an assertion that this is the correct way to view the game, but a compromise saying, I guess if you have to view it as canon, here's how you can work it into the broader story. But based on this quote, it doesn't seem like that's how they intended for the game to be viewed. Again, I think this game is just meant to be a standalone, non-canon arena that only exists to give players a new way to play around with Elden Ring's combat mechanics. I know it's hard for this fandom, but let's all try as hard as we can to not read too much into it. When I started writing this script, as you can probably tell from the start of the video, I intended for it to have a more neutral, non-committal conclusion. But the more I looked into the quotes in the game content, the more I felt like Nightreign just is not meant to be canon at all. By the way, I made this video before DC freaked out about one of their writers laughing at Charlie Kirk's murder, which is an objectively hilarious situation. And I'm not about to redo this video for a fourth time, so don't take the inclusion of Peacemaker and other DC stuff as promotion of their content. I certainly don't endorse the idea of giving them money while they're defending fascists. In fact, if you're going to consume their content, I recommend finding a way to do it that doesn't support the company at all. And if you're watching this on the day I uploaded it, happy holidays, and rest in piss, Charlie.